The Peaceful Aura-Nibbling Dungeon by Dryad Klowden. Narrated by J. Aldridge. Giggling, the gaggle of goblinettes giddily gallivanted as they galloped to the dungeon gate. "Say it again, Daddy," the young dungeon pleaded. Her daddy obliged her with her favorite true tale turned telepathic tongue twister, and had her try to echo it. Practicing emulating speaking in the common language used by both adventurers and monsters with telepathic tongue twisters was among the earliest lessons in Dungeon Core homeschooling. The better versed in common speech wordplay Dungeon Cores were from their childhood, the more complex and enjoyable the wordplay they could manifest for riddles and quests to please their visitors when they were grown. Luxuriating in laughter was an antidote to the taunting his daughter had received from the other young crystalline dungeon cores, her peer group of gemstones who would grow up to emulate their own dungeon buildings when they amassed enough of the ambient energy known as mana and enough knowledge. They had teased her for being different, enough such that she had asked to be homeschooled. And with the adventurer's Mother's Day around the corner, what better way to simultaneously teach his precious offspring some wordplay, some enunciation, and why her mother was the safest, most beloved, trusted, respected dungeon among all adventurers and monsters of any species in their vicinity, and truly unique, different, special, and perfect, just like her. Her mother dungeon and the building and grounds she emanated as their home were a haven, a sacred grove for rejuvenation, all by her mother's dedicated design. Welcome to Paulette's Palace of Palettes, Palettes, and Palettes, the peaceful Aura-Nibbling Dungeon. Please, no pondering the populace, the guards greeted the goblinettes. The gracious guards gathered the gub-struck goblinettes and, "Darling, if you focus on your adorable alliterations, our dear daughter won't have time for her manifesting meditation this morning," pretty precious stone Paulette politely pronounced with a telepathic wink and peck, beaming beatifically at her beau and babe. The gemstone equivalent of a grin graced all of her facets as all three of the loving families settled in on their cozy couch for the dad's rosy recapitulation. It unfolded approximately thus. "Is it true?" the first goblinette asked the first guard. "Is this dungeon really a vampire?" Amid nervous titters from the younglings, the guards flashed each other knowing smiles and encouraged them to sit comfortably for a moment, to become familiar with the ambience of the dungeon before them, and to evaluate whether they'd agreed to its terms and enter. "What have you heard? Let's start there," kindly offered the guard. Timidly, the second goblinette whispered, "We heard that no one ever leaves the dungeon with any treasure. Sometimes they think they're going to just be there an hour, and they stay all night. Sometimes the dungeon feeds on them. Like a vampire, if we enter, will the dungeon eat us?" The human guard dismounted her faithful hippogriff steed and removed her helmet so the younglings could see the sincerity of her smile. "All who enter our dungeon agree to her terms. She's very clear with everyone from the beginning what their experiences will include, though each adventurer or monster who enters of any species, from any land, is welcome to innovate their own experiences within her parameters. The only blood drawn anywhere in the dungeon is the prick of a finger to produce a blood ink for a quill, signing the magically binding agreement." On this note in the narrative, Paulette politely paused her partner to give their charming child a chance to chime in. "Sweetie, do you remember what our motto is? The first nursery rhyme we ever taught you?" Beaming throughout her gem, their little one recited from rote. "All shall be fed, no blood shall be shed." Paulette and her husband empathically linked to confer and agree it was time for their daughter to understand their dungeon's ethos and origins, and how she herself came to be. "Very good, sweetie, very good. Soon I shall reveal what every adventurer or monster learns from the guards or the welcome gnome the first time they approach and ask to meet me and explore the grounds and facilities I emanate and develop. First, though, a bit of context. When I was a youngling dungeon, just like you, I was simply lonely. I was an only child, and my only companions were the monsters your Grandby dungeon manifested. Many of them were so very scary, all the gnashing teeth and prickly scales and acid fire breathing and stomping. I tried so hard to have them as my friends, I tried every day to get them to notice me and care how I was doing, because I cared how they were doing.
Only one monster ever seemed to register how loudly I was thinking in its direction.
Please, Mr. Monster, can't you stay safe today and come play with me?
Once, the one jubilant day of my whole childhood, I very clearly heard him think back at me. Thank you kindly, little missy. I shall do what I can, after I do what I must. That one conversation, that was the only thing ever I experienced in my whole childhood that I could consider as having formed a friendship. Each day I would think invitingly, caringly toward my new would-be playmate, and each night he would think back appreciatively, truly, but bound to his service. All of the rest of your Grampy's Dungeons monsters' thoughts that I could hear were always about marauding, and I just had to tune them out and stop trying to convince them to be my playmates. And even if I wanted them to be, your Grampy Dungeon always had them conquering other dungeons, and not all of them would make it home. Your Granny Dungeon told me not to get too attached, so I thought maybe I could make friends with the guests they were letting visit, the adventurers. But the adventurers didn't seem to know or care that I existed, and many of them, well, the monsters didn't let many of them stick around long either, and I wasn't supposed to care, but I did. Mommy told me not to let Daddy know, that it was very unique and special and not supposed to happen to a dungeon, but I could feel them. Anytime one of Daddy's monsters was defeated in our halls, and any time an adventurer was vanquished in our chambers, I could feel them. I could hear their thoughts. I could see who they would be missing, who they cared about, who they loved, whose final moments in battle they had witnessed before their own, through their own eyes. I could taste how their auras changed in moments they experienced before fear and loss. I could taste how they would exude joy and relief if their comrades saved them, if they made it through another day of adventuring or monstering intact and together. When I told Mommy I could feel grief and taste auras, she bade me hush. I was never to think another word of this anywhere anyone could hear. Empaths and energy vampires are not welcome among dungeon kind. It would defeat the purpose of all the elaborate trap building and monster army amassing and strategizing and clan rivalries and everything your daddy dungeon promulgates. If a dungeon could gather energy simply by tasting adventurers directly, without the adventurers having to die in a dungeon for their mana to be absorbed, or if a dungeon cared too much for the adventurers to function, your Granny Dungeon had quietly cautioned me. There has to be a better way, I had consoled myself. We dungeons can coexist mutually beneficially with adventurers, rather than set our traps and send our monsters to kill them to absorb their mana, I envisioned. I resolved to find a way to manifest that symbiosis, and to extend it equally to monsters. As soon as I could gather enough valor, I rolled out to find my own path. My peers disdained me, claiming that to be a pacifist dungeon was an oxymoron. Ostracized, other dungeons laughed, but I did not mind. I wanted the pain to stop. Years of feeling, hearing, seeing, tasting grief, lampooning that I cared about what happened to adventurers, bellicose bully dungeons teased me, calling me human-smitten, or even humans-mitten. But it was not just humans. Adventurers of all species, monsters of all species, mourning for loss was universal. I did not differentiate among the various ways of outwardly acknowledging the passing of a comrade or a loved one unique to elves or orcs, some of which resembled celebrations of memories. Their internal sensations of loss, to me, were all as one. Any grief was more than I could bear, in a transcendent, mana-manifesting meditation, just like the lessons your daddy and I give you. I observed about myself that were anyone to perish in my own emanations as I grew into full dungeonhood, it would shatter me. I knew other dungeons had used a portion of their mana to build gardens. That appealed to me, a place of peace. If an adventurer were to visit, if I were to taste their aura, I yearned for that to be only the sweet flavors of relief, release, relaxation, joy, such as can be felt in the serenity of nature at a time of internal and external peace. Aura, you see, is mana that living beings naturally emanate. Like any other mana, it can be the source of nourishment for us dungeons. The naturally emanating glow of a healthy, living being's aura is a renewable resource, something most don't even realize that they are producing, and if sampled in small enough doses at a time, may be absorbed by a courteous, thoughtful, respectful dungeon with no ill effect to the other living being. Rather than profit from slaughter, rather than obtaining my sustenance at the expense of adventurers and monsters by reclaiming their mana when they died on the premises I manifested, I had vowed to myself that, were I ever to ingest some of the mana that other living beings naturally emanate, it would not ever be for malice, only to nourish. I would merely lure adventurers and monsters in with joys, and with their informed consent, I would simply nibble safe amounts of the mana of each for my survival. You see, the more joy, glee, relaxation, relief, fulfillment, connection, rejuvenation, health a living being experiences, the more vibrant and full and strong and resilient their aura becomes. The more they replenish, the more they can share, a reciprocation, symbiosis, respectful and fair. And so I emanated, manifested, and cultivated all you see here. The how doesn't matter. That's a story for when you've grown enough to learn dungeoneering for yourself, Paulette lovingly expressed to her adoring dungeon core daughter. The why is our lesson for today, she continued. I simply recognize that by providing the right healing environments, I could provide adventurers and even monsters with so much fulfillment during their visits to me that they had more aura than they could need it to survive. I can skim the mana from their excess aura, such that I survive courtesy of their energy, but while doing them no lasting harm, rather than setting traps or sending monsters into battle with adventurers to absorb their mana when they died in my dungeon, like how all my peers and relatives had fed for millennia. I wanted none of that bitterness, only the sweetness of their healing in me. At most, if I were particularly depleted and in need of replenishment, if I ingested a tidbit more of their aura than they anticipated, and their mana stores dipped just a teensy bit, they might need to nap a bit in me while I lovingly comfort them. Well, there are, as you know, dear, guest suites in the cottage out back. Sometimes they make pallets, straw beds, to stay near their horses, unicorns, pegasi, hippogriffs, or other steeds in our barns. In time word spread of a dungeon who did not set traps, but set out welcome mats, who did not breed marauding monsters, but adopted stray birds and grazing animals, and gave them room to freely raise their families without fear of commodification and feasting, who thirsted not for blood or notoriety or conquest, but for companionship and serenity, welcoming adventurers of all species and monsters of all species equally, so long as they pledged peaceful conduct within her. The first curious explorers were surprised yet pleased that I had addressed them directly, and when I explained my philosophy and intent. Weary of always feeling on edge, never knowing what travails faced them around the next corner, both my first adventurer guests and my first monster guests were grateful for a moment in an oasis, enough to volunteer to sustain me with donations of bits of mana. They, and those who followed, and those here now, all accepted the gentle risks for the bounty I can provide, and they helped me strengthen and expand, in return for extended stay in my safe, sheltering dungeon. Paulette paused a moment to beam at her husband, as handsome as the day they'd met, all those many moons ago, the day she first opened herself to explorers. Feeling his wife's crystalline vibrations brimming with emotion, the devoted dragon, the son of her first friend, sent to check on her after she disappeared, picked up where she left off, establishing a mutual covenant among us to do no harm, and only help each other grow and heal. Your mommy dungeon, with the help of her first inhabitants among us monster kind and adventurer kind in tandem, grew beautiful serene gardens, and became known as a haven for those recovering from the trauma of watching their peers be slain by rivals in other dungeons. All who visit your mommy dungeon have to sign in blood that they will adhere to strict rules of no harming or killing each other in her sacred space. A reciprocal effect spell permanently cast by an early druid guest at your mommy dungeon's request is announced at the door. Any harm an adventurer or monster enacts on any non-flora living being within her dungeon's grounds and facilities would cause the same damage upon them as their intended victim. In all these years, it has only been tested once, long ago, and she still grieves of it. But because of that spell and its ethos, word spread that of all dungeons in the known world, only in hers could adventurers and monsters truly rest, knowing they may do so undisturbed. Upon first arriving, all explorers are welcomed into your Mommy Dungeon's ever-expanding art studio. Each is offered a menu from which to select the art, craft, and writing media most to their comfort or fulfillment, or most of interest to learn. Not as trade, though that may be a natural outgrowth, but as therapeutic expression, as recreational therapy for the battle-weary, a way to make whole and clear a clouded vision, a way to replenish a soul. The more they replenish, the more they can share. A reciprocation, symbiosis, respectful and fair. That's your Mommy Dungeon's second motto. Each explorer selects also the colors that serve as their personal palette, the reflections of their experience intrinsically unique to them. What they pour out of themselves onto written pages, or canvases, or labyrinths of herbs, or intricate designs of particles of sand, unburdens their souls and elevates their joy. And the organic produce from her dungeon garden is Edenic by design. The hardier the constitutions of her visitors, the more your Mommy Dungeon is fed herself. The produce and livestock are free range, organically fed, and never slaughtered. They are also subject to the reciprocal damage rule, which was the one case a hungry adventurer had violated it. His attempt to lasso a steer for steak was a high-stakes mistake. The rope circled round to begin to approach the adventurer's own neck, which caused him quite a fright. Fortunately, he was unharmed, and learned his lesson, but that one taste of fear on her sacred grounds shook your Mommy Dungeon so that she still grieves of it, which only served to strengthen her resolve in maintaining the sanctity of her premises. Blessedly, no adventurers nor monsters have ever perished in her, a tender mercy. Explorers, your Mommy Dungeon's name for our guests, could only benignly harvest eggs and milk from her chickens, ducks, geese, quail, sheep, goats, cows, and buffalo, all living, natural-born beings, not mana manifestations. They or their ancestors were welcomed through the gates as wanderers searching, like each of us, drawn to this constellation of ley lines and healing matrices, for a peaceful harbor. It became a source of local pride for explorers of any species to gain a reputation for what they innovated, recipes from ingredients in her garden, barn, pasture, herbarium, new forms of art and craft, poems and lyrics of new meters. That some even left the adventuring or monstering life to become farmers or restaurateurs, or practitioners or patrons of the creative and expressive arts, your Mommy Dungeon considers her greatest contribution to world peace. But to the locals, she is the contribution. She herself is the peace. Having a haven is so replenishing to peace of mind that many knowingly, willingly, even eagerly consent to sharing a piece of their essential energy. May all be fed, with no blood shed. Her motto and her vision, our ethos and origin. And now, dear daughter, you may be proud to live at Paulette's Palace of Palettes, beds of straw, palettes, flavors of cuisine, and palettes, ranges of colors, the peaceful Aura-Nibbling dungeon. And if anyone teases you as a chip off the peaceful Aura-Nibbling block, and yes, sweetie, you really are a chip, voluntarily sliced from your Mommy Dungeon's crystal, imbued with your daddy dragon's mana. You just sprout your cute teensy little wings and breathe your cute teensy little puff of flame at them from your cute teensy little crystal and be proud. Proud to be the only one of your kind in the known world. Just like your Mommy Dungeon. The closest thing to a group hug that a dragon, a dungeon crystal, and their hybrid daughter can accomplish ensued, followed by giggles and the most heartening session of mana manifesting meditation yet in their peaceful Aura-Nibbling dungeon.